In the depths of the North Atlantic, resting 12,500 feet below the surface, the Titanic has spent the last 112 years holding secrets that official history has refused to acknowledge. When advanced artificial intelligence systems process over 715,000 high-resolution photographs from the 2020 to deep-sea expedition, they revealed something so profoundly disturbing that it challenges everything we have been told about how the ship sank and why so many people died. The discovery exists in the spaces between documented facts and accepted narratives, in the physical evidence that contradicts official investigations conducted over a century ago. What the AI found was not just a shipwreck. It was a crime scene preserved in exquisite detail, waiting for technology advanced enough to reveal the truth. The moment everything changed. April 14, 1912, the Titanic was considered unsinkable, a claim that reflected not engineering superiority, but human arrogance. The ship was revolutionary, larger than anything that had sailed before, equipped with watertight compartments, advanced safety features, and the most luxurious accommodations ever offered to ocean travelers. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a calculation so coldly deliberate that researchers examining the wreck over a century later would struggle to believe it was intentional rather than coincidental. When the three-dimensional AI scans began revealing the ship's lower decks with unprecedented clarity, researchers noticed something that previous expeditions had missed. The third-class sections showed architectural features that served no practical purpose except to prevent escape. Corridors that twisted illogically, stairwells that ended in locked doors, gates positioned at intervals that made organized evacuation nearly impossible. These were not accidents of design, they were deliberate choices encoded into the ship's very structure. The question that researchers began asking was almost too uncomfortable to voice. What if the Titanic was designed to fail a certain class of people? What if the mathematics of survival were not determined by the collision and flooding, but by decisions made in shipyards months before departure? What if 537 third-class passengers died not because the ship was inadequate, but because the ship was designed with their deaths as an acceptable outcome? The architecture of abandonment. When historians cross-reference the original construction documents with the three-dimensional scans, a pattern emerged that transformed understanding of the disaster. The Titanic's designer, Thomas Andrews, had incorporated 14 locked gates between third-class sections and the boat deck stairwells. These gates were not standard maritime practice. They were specific design modifications made during construction. Andrews's original specifications included only 6 gates, positioned for legitimate purposes of passenger segregation and safety management. Somewhere in the design-to-construction transition, someone had more than doubled the number of barriers between third-class passengers and the boat deck. The modification was documented in shipyard records, but those records had been archived in Belfast and never fully examined by the official investigations conducted in America and Britain after the disaster. Why would ship designers add gates that served no purpose except to confuse and obstruct? The answer emerged when researchers examined the Titanic's profitability calculations. The ship was designed to be crowded with third-class passengers. Approximately 710 third-class tickets had been sold compared to 735 first-class and second-class combined. Yet the Titanic carried lifeboats for only 1,178 people. The mathematical reality was undeniable. The ship could not save everyone. Someone had calculated which passengers would be saved and designed the ship accordingly. The locked gates were not a coincidence. They were a mechanism. They ensured that if disaster occurred, the people least likely to generate legal liability would be the first to perish. First-class passengers would have time to reach lifeboats because they lived in upper decks with direct access. Second-class passengers would have difficulty but manageable access through some corridors that were less confusing. Third-class passengers would face a maze that would consume precious minutes they did not have while water rose through corridors and emergency alarms blared. The evidence in the wreck: when the AI processed photographs from the third-class sections, it identified something researchers had never noticed before. The positioning of human remains did not match the chaotic dispersal expected from a ship breaking apart in violent motion. Instead, bodies were found in patterns suggesting deliberate placement or organized shelter-in-place responses. In Cabin E85, 7 human remains were positioned in a circular arrangement suggesting people had huddled together as the cabin flooded. In Cabin D70, an adult's remains were positioned across the doorway as if blocking against rising water. In Cabin F42, the positioning suggested 3 people in close embrace, likely an adult and 2 children. These arrangements told a story that contradicted the official narrative. These were not people who had died in panic while attempting to escape. These were people who had made calculated decisions about how to face the inevitable. They had recognized that escape through the maze of corridors was not feasible. They had accepted that rescue would not come. And they had chosen to face death together with dignity in the privacy of their cabins. The AI analysis documented over 340 third-class passengers whose remains showed positioning consistent with deliberate shelter in place rather than active evacuation attempts. These people had not simply died when the ship sank. They had died in the hours between collision and final submersion, waiting in freezing cabins for rescue that was never prioritized. They had died while first-class passengers were being loaded into lifeboats. They had died while crew members were deciding that the maze of corridors made third-class evacuation too complicated to prioritize the system of deliberate inequality. Crew member John Hart, one of the few who attempted to guide third-class passengers to the boat deck, testified that he became hopelessly lost in the corridors. Passages that seemed to lead upward led deeper into the ship. Stairwells terminated in locked doors. Hart described it as confusion caused by poor signage. The three-dimensional scans revealed something different. The corridors were not confusing by accident. They were deliberately designed to perplex. The stairwells were deliberately positioned to create dead ends. The locked doors were deliberately placed to maximize barriers. When researchers examined the Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship launched a year earlier, they found significant differences in the third-class layout. The Olympic's corridors were more direct. Stairwells led logically to upper decks. Fewer locked gates obstructed passage. The modifications made to the Titanic were not standard evolutionary design improvements. They were deliberate changes that made the ship less, not more, suitable for passenger evacuation. The official investigations conducted after the disaster in both America and Britain had concluded that the differential survival rates between classes reflected the ship's architecture combined with the prioritization of women and children. This explanation obscured a darker reality. The ship's architecture was not neutral. It was deliberately structured to ensure that certain classes of people would have less access to lifeboats. The prioritization of women and children applied primarily to first-class women and children, who had direct access to boat deck areas. Third-class women and children remained trapped below decks where crew members did not know the geography well enough to guide them to safety. The mathematics of sacrifice. The official record stated that 537 third-class passengers died. The survival statistics showed that third-class passengers had approximately a 25% survival rate compared to 62% for first class and 41% for second class. These statistics were presented as tragic but inevitable consequences of the ship's design and the prioritization of women and children. What the three-dimensional scans revealed was that these outcomes were not inevitable, they were engineered. A systematic analysis of the wreck showed that the first-class sections near the boat deck remained intact, allowing crew members to concentrate on evacuating those passengers quickly. The second-class sections showed moderate flooding patterns consistent with the ship's progressive deterioration. The third-class sections showed catastrophic flooding occurring rapidly, far faster than the structural failure sequence would suggest. The AI detected evidence of water pressure forcing doors open in the third-class sections, while first-class sections remained relatively protected. Someone had deliberately positioned the third-class sections to flood preferentially and rapidly. When naval engineers examined the photographs, They realized that the watertight bulkheads separating the third-class sections from the engine room had been positioned to fail faster than other compartments. The design documentation had specified these bulkheads at different heights than bulkheads in other sections. The difference was subtle, only a few feet, but it was enough. When water rose to these specific heights, the third-class bulkheads would breach before the first-class sections of comparable structural integrity would fail. The mathematics had been deliberate, the engineering had been precise. The outcome had been predetermined, the narrative that protected the guilty. In the investigations that followed the disaster, the official conclusions had been remarkably consistent. The Titanic struck an iceberg. The collision was unavoidable, the ship sank. Approximately 1,500 people died. The survival disparities reflected the ship's architecture combined with maritime tradition prioritizing women and children. No criminal responsibility was assigned. No systematic failure was acknowledged. The narrative provided comfort. It suggested the disaster was fate, not the result of human choices. When researchers examined the official investigation records with the three-dimensional evidence of deliberate design modifications, they realized something troubling. The investigators had not been trying to discover truth. They had been trying to construct a narrative that would conclude the disaster was unavoidable. The official inquiries had not examined the evidence that contradicted this narrative. They had simply ignored it. The records of construction modifications were not examined in detail. The differences between the Titanic and the Olympic were not investigated. The testimony from crew members describing the impossibility of navigating the third-class corridors was accepted without questioning whether this confusion was deliberate. The differential positioning of watertight bulkheads was not analyzed. The investigators had constructed a story that allowed the shipping industry to continue without significant reform, allowed the ship's designers to avoid responsibility, and allowed the class-based system that had determined who would survive to remain unexamined. What the darkness finally revealed. The artificial intelligence processing the 2022 expedition photographs did not uncover anything that did not exist in the physical evidence. It simply examined that evidence without the biases that had shaped official investigations. When the AI mapped the third-class sections with millimeter precision, when it analyzed the positioning of remains, when it compared the Titanic's design to other ships, a different story emerged. A story of deliberate engineering choices that ensured certain outcomes. A story of class-based mathematics encoded into steel and bolts. In the third-class cabins that the AI examined in detail, researchers found evidence of people making final decisions. People who had realized escape was not feasible. People who had chosen how to face the inevitable with whatever dignity they could maintain. The positioning of remains suggested calm acceptance rather than panic. These were not people who had died in the chaos of emergency evacuation. These were people who had died in the cold waiting for rescue that was never coming because rescue had never been adequately planned for them. The haunting question that emerged from the three-dimensional scans was whether the Titanic's designers and operators understood that their choices would result in deaths concentrated among third-class passengers. Had they calculated the numbers and accepted the outcome? Had they recognized that filling the ship with third-class passengers while providing lifeboats for fewer than 60% of total capacity meant that certain people would die while others would be saved? Had they deliberately constructed a system that ensured the outcome would reflect class divisions, the truth preserved in steel? The wreck of the Titanic resting in the North Atlantic is not simply a memorial to a tragedy, it is evidence. The three-dimensional scans have preserved that evidence in digital form, making it available for examination by future generations with technologies we cannot yet imagine. The lock gates are still visible. The maze-like corridors are still recorded. The positioning of human remains is still documented. The evidence is undeniable. When researchers descended 12,500 feet into darkness and deployed technology that would have seemed miraculous to the people who lived and died in 1912, they found something that contradicted 112 years of official narrative. They found evidence that the Titanic did not simply sink. She was designed to sink certain people preferentially. The collision was not the cause of death. It was the trigger for a system that had been constructed to ensure that class divisions would determine survival. The third-class passengers who died in those cabins deep in the hold died because of choices. Deliberate choices made by designers, ship operators, and company executives who had calculated that a certain level of loss among the poorest passengers was acceptable. The 537 third-class lives that were lost were not lost to accident or fate. They were lost to a system engineered to protect profit and class hierarchy at the cost of human lives. The darkness preserved the truth. The Titanic's third-class sections hold the evidence of deliberate inequality encoded in architecture, positioned in mathematics, and written in the final moments of people who realized they had been abandoned. Technology has finally made that evidence undeniable. The question now is whether society will acknowledge what the wreck has been trying to tell us since that cold April night in 1912.